expanding their powers across Europe and trying to control our lives by limiting the freedom to drink a beer, eat a hamburger, or enjoy an e-cigarette in many circumstances. A nanny state with paternalistic politicians tries to control people's lives without their consent. They might claim to do this for the greater good, but ultimately their actions are illiberal and ineffective. Epicenter's Nanny State Index ranks 30 countries in Europe based on how much they overregulate the eating, drinking, vaping and smoking habits of their citizens. More paternalism doesn't lead to better health outcomes. Take a look at Germany and Luxembourg, two European countries with very liberal regulations and long life expectancy, and contrast them with the Baltics and their paternalistic regulations, combined with worse health outcomes. Paternalism means all the pain but none of the gain. Politicians across Europe should look at their counterparts in Germany and Luxembourg and draw some inspiration from them. People in charge of their own life are happier and healthier. There is no need for bossy politicians to protect us from ourselves. If you are interested in the full results, go to nannystateindex.org and help us build a less nannying Europe.
Indeed, do check out nannystateindex.org, but also stay with us for the next hour as we dive deeply into the regulatory affairs of European countries. So welcome to the launch of the Nanny State Index. My name is Adam Bartha, and I'm the director of the Epicenter Network, which is a great network of 9 European classical liberal think tanks. And I'm tremendously excited to have 4 amazing guests with us from across Europe who will be discussing the results of the index with me. But before we dive into the details, let's get over some of the compulsory housekeeping rules. I'm obliged to warn you that today's discussion is recorded and live streamed on the IS YouTube channel. And for guests on the Zoom site, if you do wish to ask a question, please do select the Q&A function at the bottom of your screens and type out your question either with your name or without your name. And during the Q&A session, I will be reading out the questions that you have posted for our guests to address. And if you're rather on the shy side, and then you also have the ability to upvote questions that you would like to see answered. And if we do have a great number of questions, then I will be proceeding in a pretty democratic manner, and I will make sure to address those questions that got the most votes. And last but not least, also feel free to utilize the chat function, which will enable you to send many articles to attendees and say hello to us or other attendees, but please do not post your questions here. All questions should be posted to the Q&A function. And with that out of the way, now on to the exciting parts. First and foremost, I do have the pleasure to introduce the man of the hour, the editor of the Nanny State Index, who's also the head of lifestyle economics at the Institute of Economic Affairs, Christopher Snowdon. Chris is very much into investigating everything that's related to pleasure, prohibition, and dodgy statistics. And he is also a very productive author of numerous books, including Killjoys, Selfishness, Greed, and Capitalism, and The Art of Suppression. After Chris will be introducing the index, we will turn to Finland, the country that has lost its not so prestigious title as the most nannying place in Europe. And we will be joined by Lasse Pippinen, who is the CEO of Libera, our partner think tank that advocates for individual liberty and free markets in Finland. After the North, we will be turning to freer places and we'll be joined by Martin Gündiger from Austria. And Martin is a research fellow at the Austrian Economic Center and the Hayek Institute. And he's an economist whose research interests include tax policy, technological innovation, as well as philosophy, psychology, and medicine. So a man of many talents. And from Vienna, then we will turn to the most Western former Habsburg country, today known as Spain. And it's my great pleasure to welcome Antonio Umuli, who is a senior researcher at Civismo, our Spanish member think tank. And he previously worked for several financial institutions and the Embassy of Spain in Washington, D.C. So gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have you with us today. And Chris, if you don't mind me turning to you first as the editor of the index, then I would like you to outline some of the key findings and key data that you have found. I know that this is a very complex piece of data gathering from 30 different countries in Europe that you have been working on for months and months. So I'm sure that you could talk for very long. But if you had to highlight the kind of most absurd findings and the overall trends and the report, what would those findings be?
Thanks, Adam. So I should explain what the Nanny State Index is. We've been doing it since 2016. This is the 4th edition. We do it every 2 years now. We've expanded it from 28 EU countries to the EU 27 plus UK, and also now Iceland and Norway. Those 2 new additions have made quite an impact. Norway is top of the table now. Being top is bad. Being at the bottom is good, unless you are a paternalist, in which case being at the top is good. And really, every time we produce this index, it just gets more and more depressing from a liberal point of view. There are more and more regulations. Generally speaking, there are more and more taxes and higher taxes. Every now and again, there's a small victory, but it usually comes about as a result of maybe a court ruling that such and such a law is unconstitutional, or there's been a few examples of governments, particularly in Eastern Europe, having to freeze taxes or reduce taxes because there was cross-border shopping. That's quite a common problem, particularly with alcohol. But generally speaking, things get worse. You might think with COVID-19 that politicians have got bigger fish to fry than banning e-cigarette fluids or taxing sugary drinks, but no, it hasn't. Doesn't seem to have slowed down the nanny state bandwagon at all. And there's a lot of stuff in the pipeline. Denmark and the Netherlands really stand out for having a really big agenda now next year or so. For example, I think both countries are going to put e-cigarettes in plain packaging, which is a fairly extreme thing to do. All told, as I say, Norway is top. Germany is bottom as the freest country. Not only does it come bottom of the league table, but it comes bottom of every individual category. It's the freest country for food and soft drinks, for e-cigarettes, for tobacco, and for vape and for alcohol. For smoking, tobacco, UK is top. For alcohol, Lithuania is top. It's had a lot of quite heavy temperance policies in recent years, including raising the age at which alcohol can be bought to 20. Norway comes top for e-cigarettes because it's banned them completely. Norway actually has committed to legalizing e-cigarettes and regulating them in the way that the EU does, or the kind of minimum standards that the EU require. It hasn't got around to doing that yet, but when it does, it probably will slip down the table a little bit. And for food, it's Adam's homeland of Hungary comes top. Thanks to a lot of taxes on all sorts of different types of food, as well as various drinks, including sugary drinks and energy drinks. In total, of the 30 countries, 12 of them now have sugar taxes on sugary drinks. Some of those countries also tax artificially sweetened drinks, which have no sugar and no calories. So the idea that this is all about health is not always backed up by the facts. 13 countries now tax e-cigarettes. I think when we first started doing this in 2016, there were maybe 1 or 2. There were certainly very few. And 17 countries, the majority, now have vaping bans, which nearly always just include vaping in existing smoking bans, which, again, very little scientific justification for that, and a big deterrent, I guess, to people who are thinking of switching from smoking. And 6 or 7 countries have plain packaging for tobacco. That hasn't rolled on as quickly as some people thought it might do. And one sign that things are always getting worse is I have to keep including new subcategories in the index. So last time I had to include a category for minimum unit pricing for alcohol. Scotland and Wales have that. Ireland have recently said they're going to bring it in really quite soon. And another thing, thanks to Ireland, I had to include this year is the booze curtain. This is a retail display ban of the type you might be familiar with for tobacco, introduced for alcohol, so that people don't see alcohol when they're in a grocery shop and get tempted into getting drunk or something, I guess. And also heated tobacco is becoming more and more popular, and so naturally governments are rushing to tax that at quite a high rate. I think the UK actually has the highest rate of tax on heated tobacco. I could, as you say, Adam, go on and on, but that is the basic gist of it. The main finding, as in previous editions, is that things are not getting any better. There's not a lot of sign things are getting any better. But also, and as the video alluded to at the beginning, there isn't any sign that this stuff is actually having much effect on people's health. You know, countries like Germany, as I say, at the bottom of every category, pretty civilized, nice place to live, fairly healthy people. It's not obvious that somewhere like Lithuania or Hungary are particularly benefiting from having quite draconian nanny state policies in a way that Luxembourg or Czechia or Germany at the bottom of the table are not. So you know, all told, this is really mostly pain and very little gain.
Loads of changes, as you have outlined, and I kind of have to take off my hats occasionally for the politicians for their creative ways. I mean, a boost curtain. I don't know whether it's, you know, people sitting in a dark room and coming up with these ideas, but some creative ways to restrict lifestyle freedoms for sure. Lasse, Finland is still one of the most nannying countries, but it was the most nannying country in Europe for all previous editions of the Nanny State Index. Now you have lost your ranking, not to one, but to two not too distant neighbors, Norway and Lithuania. Is it actually thanks to the amazing work of Libera that Finland is slowly liberalizing, or it's just a matter that other countries are becoming illiberal faster and adding multiple regulations? What's going on in Finland?
Unfortunately, we just can't take the credit. The questionable honor of losing the third place is only because of Norway and Iceland joined the game. Lithuania was the second last year. There hasn't been any improvements on these issues in Finland. I'm so sorry.
And what are kind of the new regulatory ideas that politicians are coming out? So if there's no liberalization going on, what has been the main kind of point of discussions in the last 2 years since we published the last index that you would highlight as kind of one of the most absurd regulations why Finland is ranking so high?
There is a kind of a small bubbling under discussion whether the state monopoly of alcohol retailing should be dismantled, but nothing has happened so far. And one thing that Norway actually did during COVID was that they closed down some of their state monopoly retail shops. And that didn't happen in Finland, and that was a small victory for us because I was kind of waiting for that to happen. But also a small curiosity during this weird pandemic time is that we didn't need any exceptions on the lawmaking when it comes to serving alcohol. Our serving laws are so strict and so easy to adapt that actually the politician can just kind of screw it a bit tighter and say that, sorry, you're not allowed to serve alcohol after 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And that's it, no discussion. So
that's interesting.
Yeah.
That's rather worrisome to hear. We're working together with think tanks in Turkey as well. And Turkey is, of course, much more autocratic in many regards than Finland. But that's what Erdogan also introduced, a complete ban on alcohol sales with the excuse of using the pandemic. So it's rather worrisome that there are some similarities between an autocratic Turkey and some of the most freest liberal democracies in the north. But when it comes to lifestyle regulations, that's not necessarily the case. Martin, I would like to turn to you a bit more on the sunny side of things, because Austria is one of the most liberal and most permissive countries when it comes to previous editions of the index. But now you guys lost quite a few ranks. So did Austrian politicians change their mindset and they're becoming a bit more like the rest of Europe, or what has happened in the last couple of years in Austria?
Well, great question, Adam. Let me take some time to give a quick overview on the situation in Austria. And first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to speak here. In the last 2 years, I think they weren't too good for Austria when it comes to nanny state regulation. And Corona wasn't for sure the only thing to blame for that. Let's take a look at the good, the bad, and the ugly for Austria. The good first, when it comes to food and soft drinks, there aren't many restrictions. There are, of course, some discussions when it comes to regulating food and soft drinks, and of course about sin taxes for unhealthy food. And the same also goes for things like the Nutri-Score. But on the whole, Austria remained relatively non-intrusive in that sector. In the sector of alcohol, Austria is also relatively liberal. Some might argue that the Austrian government is only so liberal because alcohol enables the public to better deal with all the bad policies our government is pursuing. I don't know about that, but one thing is for sure, namely that the pushback against restrictions on alcohol consumption is very, very strong. And that goes especially for wine and beer, which is probably related to the culture, as this is also the case, for example, for Bavaria and for Czech Republic. Let's now take a look at the bad. You know what, let's scratch that. We'll go straight to the ugly because that's how bad it is. And that's the area of smoking when it comes to both e-cigarettes and tobacco. Austria went from being one of the most liberal countries in Europe in these areas to being one of the most restrictive ones. The reason is a new smoking ban that was introduced in 2019 when the new government consisting of the People's Party and the Green Party took office. They completely outlawed smoking in bars, restaurants, workplaces, further undermining property rights in effect. The discussion around the ban was framed more on whether people liked smoking or whether they think it's unhealthy, and not on whether people think it should be allowed for people to do something the majority doesn't like, as long as these people aren't forced to participate. And that's the sad thing, I think. It is a perfect example of how people are asked what their preferences are, and then a regulation is passed founded on that. And not whether, they are not asked whether they want to coerce other people to have it their way. And again, that's unfortunate, I think. In the end, let me circle back a little bit to the issue that had a major impact.
I think we lost Martin for a second. Apologies for that one. Whilst we're fixing the kind of technological issue on Martin's side, we will turn to Spain. Sorry, Martin, I think we lost you for a second.
Okay, sorry.
Now you're back.
Okay, well, let me go back to the issue of Corona. The political reaction to the pandemic created, I think, the most extensive nanny state regulation we have probably ever seen. And I think it will be a huge struggle to roll back all of this regulation, and maybe even more regulation. It would be needed, but it's for sure a struggle worth having. And I'm looking forward for the discussion now.
I think you're completely right when it comes to temporary restrictions to freedom. We should be incredibly vigilant because a lot of these temporary restrictions are going to stick around for the foreseeable future. So I'm very keen to address the kind of theoretical discussion when it comes to whether nannying is justifiable from a political perspective. So we will come back to that. But before that, I want to hear the thoughts of Antonio from Spain as well. Because as you know, Antonio, we classical liberals are often complaining about left-wing politicians over-regulating the economy and over-regulating the society. But Spain, which is ruled by a far-left and socialist coalition, is actually ranking pretty decently on the index, I have to say. So how come that Spanish left-wing politicians are able to resist what a lot of the liberal and conservative-leaning politicians in other countries aren't able to resist? How come they're not as over-regulatory as many of their counterparts across Europe?
Well, thank you for the question, Adam. It's a fantastic question. Thank you for having us, and congratulations to Chris for his great job. Well, the question is great. And as you can imagine, many people have come up since yesterday, since the index was released, with the same question. And it was really surprising for a Spaniard. Spain ranked well high in freedom. It is not common for us. So there was a common comment between people. It was something similar to, I'm afraid the government will realize there's room for them to control more our lives more without being an outlier. And well, the truth, even though there is room for them to harmonize, as they say, they love that word, they know there is. And they know we are well ranked in that sense. And they do that on purpose. There is a will behind it. There are many reasons, many small reasons, but I don't want to be too long, and I don't want to focus on the small reasons, such as can be tobacco or wine, which are still very important industries in some areas in Spain, protected as well. But there's a main reason behind it. It has nothing to do with the government's belief in free market. It is tourism, and there is a strong will to protect it from the government. They know if they are harsh in terms of direct taxes with those products that are appealing and are the base of our touristic industry or touristic offer, they know they will automatically harm first thousands of families. Around 20% of our GDP is directly connected to tourism, directly, not only directly, and so that will be really unpopular to be tough on one of these parameters. And on top of that, they know that by going straight forward to these products, they would harm their fiscal income at the end of the day. So we are not competing we are competing in those terms when it comes to tourism. Of course, we're talking about the past, because after this year and a half, we don't know what's going to happen. Tourism has changed drastically, and it's hard to forecast. Arguably, it is really hard to say that we will receive the same amount of tourists soon, more than 80 million a year, which is a crazy number. So all in all, it is not due to our government's belief in free market. It is let's say, a collateral benefit of their mercantilism and protectionism.
Sure, I understand, but it's still reasonably good that these incentives matter. And just because that tourism and tax incomes are important to the Spanish government, they do realize that over-regulation on this front would actually harm them. So at the end of the day, not for the right reasons, but it's good that they have adopted some of these policies. When we are talking about this topic, it really kind of pops out that there is a massive difference between different EU countries when it comes to regulating these areas. So I have seen a lot of questions in the Q&A function. If you are also willing to ask more, then please feel free to do so. But I have a couple of questions to Chris and the panelists. So the divergent kind of attitude that's prevalent across Europe, how much does the EU engage in this area, Chris? If there would be, completely independent, sovereign national governments in 30 countries with no EU regulation, would countries actually be better or be worse, or roughly remain the same if there weren't an EU Commission harmonizing some of these regulations at least?
I think if there was no EU, the gap between the bottom and top would be wider, partly because some countries simply wouldn't have brought in the kind of regulation that the EU has brought in, but also because the freedom of movement and the common market does to some extent restrict how much governments can put sin taxes on tobacco and alcohol in particular. I mentioned before that you occasionally see governments pulling back on tax hikes because they see people going over the border. This is very common. Finland, Estonia, Latvia, around that neck of the woods. So actually the gap would be greater. So the harmonization has to some extent worked. The EU isn't really to blame for very much of the regulations in the index. And when it does interfere, it tends to be exclusively on tobacco and e-cigarettes. We had a tobacco products directive in 2016, which regulated e-cigarettes as well, rather dubiously. And there's another one in the pipeline for the next few years, which we don't know where it's going to lead, but there is talk about banning e-cigarette flavors, for example, which would be a really crazy thing to do. We shall see. The noises coming out so far are not particularly encouraging. There's been a scientific report, the SHEAR report on e-cigarettes, which was entirely kind of pessimistic and just looked at the downsides and didn't try and compare the very small risks of e-cigarettes against the much larger risks of smoking. So it is quite possible that the EU will bring in more regulations on that front. But since 2016, there hasn't been anything from the EU in any of our categories, except for a ban on menthol cigarettes that came in last spring. So yeah, by and large, the results that you see, the nanny state policies that we assess, they are domestic choices, which is why there's such a big gulf between Norway or Lithuania and Germany and Czechia at the bottom. I mean, obviously, if it was all EU stuff, then the gap would be much narrower.
Sure, and it's interesting to see that it's actually a non-EU country, Norway, at the top of the index. As a recent addition, fair enough, but another non-EU country, your home country, the United Kingdom, lost a lot of spots on the index. Is that because of your amazing work, or what's going on in the UK? Did Brexit suddenly free everyone's minds and suddenly adopted free market policies of the IA?
No, nothing to do with any of that. Nothing's been liberalised, except you could possibly argue alcohol taxes have been frozen for a few years. The UK government does seem aware that people don't like having their drinks taxed, so they've frozen that. So in kind of real terms, alcohol duty has fallen, but it's overwhelmingly because other countries have overtaken it. It does seem quite a sharp decline, because I think it was 4th or 5th last time, and it's now dropped to 12. It's pretty tight at the top of the table, you have to say. So small changes do make quite a big difference. But no, nothing to do with liberalisation. It's all to do with countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, putting large taxes on alcohol in particular, but also on tobacco and to some extent e-cigarettes. The one thing that kept the UK towards the middle of the table, it's actually the same thing that stops Ireland being top, because Ireland is incredibly nanny statist in nearly every respect, except one, which is e-cigarettes. The UK and Ireland both come right at the bottom of the table for e-cigarettes. It hasn't gold-plated anything that the EU has done. The UK hasn't repealed it either, which of course it could do now, but they haven't gold-plated it. They don't have taxes on e-cigarettes. They don't include vaping in smoking bans. And so because they do so well on that, it kind of flatters them, really, because they do pretty badly on all the rest of the criteria.
Sure, that makes sense. And I want to touch on a topic that Martin already mentioned a bit, kind of the theoretical justification for nannying governments. So whenever we hear about introducing new kind of regulations, whether it's on the alcohol sector, whether it's on the food or tobacco sector, we hear it that politicians are doing it because it benefits the health of their citizens. Now, Chris obviously addressed this in the report, that there is no correlation between health outcomes and how badly a country scores on the Nanny State Index, but still that's the justification. So from a purely theoretical basis, if we accept that classical liberalism is not going to be the kind of prevalent ideology across the world in the next 5-10 years, how do we counter that narrative that politicians are only trying to help their own citizens? Has there been any kind of more theoretical discussion either in Austria or in Finland when it comes to the concrete justifications, or people just simply go along with it and accept that this is not really the biggest problem of their lives, so there's not much to protest against? Martin, how do you feel about this?
Well, I don't know how to change it, but the real issue in my opinion, and maybe that points in a direction in which we can go to change the climate, maybe, is if you take responsibility from people, you get irresponsible people. It's easy, really. It's easy, but often overlooked. And we see that, for example, in the pandemic, in the reaction to the pandemic was more or less justified with the government saying, look, the people are irresponsible. And maybe that's true, but there's a story before that. Why are they irresponsible now? It is because we took responsibility from them time and time again over regulation for years and years and maybe centuries, essentially. We piled one regulation on top of the other, and then we ask ourselves, why are people getting more and more irresponsible? I just don't get it, you know? I really don't get it. Take away the regulations, take them away, give responsibility back to people, and if you do so, you will get responsible people. It's easy, and that's the point we have to drive home, in my opinion.
There's a lot in there when it comes to individual autonomy, and I guess you're right that in most areas that government is regulating, there's less and less role for the individual to decide, and more that we do through governments. But people are often voting with their feet, and I hear that has been pretty prevalent in Finland as well. Boost tourism is quite a big thing. So what do you think about this, Lasse, when it comes to the Finnish behavior? Are people silently, going along with the very strict nannying regulations, but in practice they try to find ways around it? Or are people actually overall law-abiding and decent citizens, and they're happy to be going along with a very strict attitude on lifestyle regulations?
Mainly the latter, but of course, I mean, if that's how market works, if you find it somewhere else cheaper, go and buy it. That's what happens when people take the ferry to Tallinn and buy their beers and vodkas and whatnot. But it's weird. A bit more than a half of Finns actually are nowadays against the alcohol monopoly, but still there is only a small spark of light that it might be, as I said, dismantled. But there's of course a black market for snuff as well. Tobacco is not an issue anymore, but alcohol seems to be kind of the big issue for Finns. Now we're fighting over kind of to have our right for the free movement of things within the EU, that I could actually order a box of wine from Germany, even though I would pay the extra sin tax to Finland. But still, there is no clear text in the law book that how we actually should do it. And now it's going to the EU, what's it called? The Luxembourg Court.
Court of Justice, right?
Yeah. So, of course, people are trying to find their drinks cheaper if they can, but still quite law-abiding.
Humans will remain humans, but Finns are especially law-abiding, so I get that. When it comes to kind of the scientific evidence, and I would like to turn to some of the audience questions because I've seen that a lot of them are flowing in. Patrick Strömer is asking about scientific evidence and science. So he wrote that science and scientific evidence is often highly regarded in the public health debate. How come that ambitions and regulations always prevail over outcome and actual results? And why do so little research focuses to evaluate what actually works? So why is there so little research on what works? Well, I would like to turn to Chris. I don't think there is that little research. Chris is doing a lot of it already. But are we judging these nanny state regulations based on their outcomes, or what's going on when it comes to empirical evidence?
Well, the policies are generally evaluated by the people who campaign for them. That tends to be the problem. And normally that would be considered a massive conflict of interest and wouldn't happen in science. But we see it all the time. So you have a fairly small, close-knit group of kind of activist academics who are pushing for these policies, often based on pretty poor quality computer modeling. And then a few years later, if they get evaluated at all, they'll be evaluated by those people. And they'll come and say it worked, usually again using a model. So the fact that, in fact, smoking rates or drinking related deaths didn't decline after a policy explicitly brought in to reduce smoking rates or reduce alcohol-related deaths doesn't seem to be the key factor. It doesn't seem to be the key outcome that is being looked at. And the analysis I do in the Nanny State Index, I'll gladly admit it's fairly crude, but really you should expect countries which have the most severe anti-smoking policies to have the lowest smoking rates, and vice versa. And you don't see that. And I think when you're dealing with policies that have such high costs associated with them, often literal financial costs, in addition to kind of welfare costs, we should be asking more of that, because if public health is a branch of medicine, as its advocates claim, then there has to be, I think, some equivalent to medical ethics. Public health isn't like medicine in several important ways, one of which is that it doesn't require any consent. Certainly not from everybody it's affected. At most, it gets kind of some kind of majority democratic consent. But the other difference is that in medicine, you don't just keep trying out lots of untested medical interventions. You don't just try a bit of surgery because it might work, and then you'll see later on whether or not it does. You don't try a medicine and on the entire population and see what happens, because it would be unethical. You got to have very strong scientific evidence before you introduce medical interventions, because they cause harm. If they go wrong, they cause an enormous amount of harm. And a lot of these policies do cause harm. And in many cases, it's not at all clear that the benefits outweigh the harm. And in many cases, there don't seem to be any benefits at all. But that doesn't stop them staying in place. These things very rarely get repealed, nor does it stop them spreading to other countries which try them out. Plain packaging is one quite good example. Australia brought in plain packaging nearly a decade ago now, and it hasn't taken off as a policy as quickly as some policies have. And perhaps that reflects the fact that policymakers understand that it doesn't really make any difference. But it hasn't made any difference anywhere. It's quite a significant infringement of intellectual property rights. There is a slippery slope. We've seen that with e-cigarettes. As I say, a couple of countries are looking at putting e-cigarettes into plain packaging, and there has been talk about putting food into plain packaging. So we have a failed policy which has continued to be adopted by various politicians. And has it been evaluated? Yeah, up to a point it's been evaluated. It's been evaluated by people who campaign for plain packaging. These things need to be independently evaluated, preferably by people who don't have any known opinion or prejudice in either direction, and preferably, frankly, by economists, because I actually think economists are rather better at evaluating these kind of things than people in public health are.
Sure. So basically, after the evaluation process, whenever there's no empirical evidence for these regulations to work, you would encourage to scrap them. And if some of them actually do work, would you be happy to keep some of them? Or is there kind of a more ideological justification for not controlling people's lives, even if it might lead to somewhat better health outcomes on certain circumstances?
Well, a proper evaluation would be a genuine cost-benefit analysis. And certainly from my kind of political perspective, there is nothing necessarily wrong with government health interventions if they genuinely produce more benefits than they cause harm. But you need a full cost-benefit analysis to do that, and you need to factor in things like personal well-being. people's welfare. And I don't just mean their health, I mean their happiness. Now, these are very, very difficult things to factor in. And generally speaking, you will find that actually you're better off leaving people alone, because people do naturally pursue their own well-being. So you need a very good kind of theoretical justification for intervening if that policy only affects things that are, only affects the cost and benefits of the individual. In other words, if there are no negative externalities from a product, or very small negative externalities, the government shouldn't be intervening in the first place. But at least if you try and do a cost benefit analysis, you are really having a genuine go at evidence-based policy. But we don't see that in public health. At the most, we see an attempt to show that health outcomes have improved. Well, I'm afraid health outcomes are only one part of welfare. They're only one part of well-being. They're an important part, undoubtedly. But we wouldn't sacrifice everything just for health. I mean, this brings us to the kind of debate about lockdowns and COVID policy, where there are genuine negative externalities. But even in that instance, you wouldn't do everything in your power at unlimited expense to stop anybody ever getting COVID. There are always costs and benefits, and the benefits are either ignored by people who evaluate these policies in public health, or they just don't even believe there are benefits to begin with. People don't enjoy drinking to excess. People don't enjoy smoking or using e-cigarettes. They're just addicts. Well, if you're dealing with people who don't even accept there are any benefits, these are not the kind of people who are ever going to do you a realistic cost-benefit analysis.
Martin already touched on very similar areas. And Martin, you mentioned that there is a tendency of over-regulation in all areas of government, not just lifestyle regulation. And we do have a question related to that from a anonymous attendee. The question is, were there any interesting correlations or findings that relate to the level of paternalism within certain countries and their approach to COVID? So do we see that some of these countries that rank very highly on the Nanny State Index were more prone to crack down on COVID and introduce stricter lockdowns and stricter regulations, or there cannot be seen any such correlation?
I'll answer that quickly if I can. I haven't done that analysis. I'm pretty sure that there isn't a correlation there. I mean, every country in the index locked down to varying degrees. I mean, Norway didn't actually lock down for that long. They locked down early, quite effectively, and then controlled the borders. Same with Finland. There's only really two countries in Europe that didn't lock down. It's Belarus and Sweden, two countries that have absolutely nothing in common with one another at all. So no, I don't think there was any correlation with COVID policy.
Yeah, we are doing currently a study on the lockdown effect, but not finished yet, so I can't give any good answer here. But let me go back to the question before, because that science and scientific evidence are highly regarded by the public. I'm not sure about that, especially when it comes to politicians. I think science and scientific evidence are only highly regarded if they create tasks for politicians. Unfortunately, that's the way it is nowadays. At least I think it is that way. And it even on the monetary side, scientists are awarded if they make politicians feel more important. And that's a tragedy, I think, but that's how it is.
On kind of new angles to the Nanny State Index, we have a question that I would like to pose to everyone, but maybe start with Chris first. And an attendee is asking, if each panelist could introduce one new factor to the index, what would it be and why? So we are currently measuring, of course, alcohol, soft drinks, e-cigarettes, and tobacco consumption. But if you wanted to introduce a new kind of angle to the index, what would that be? Chris, do you already have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the obvious one is gambling. Sometimes people mention cannabis to me, but cannabis is still basically illegal everywhere. I mean, if lots of countries start legalizing cannabis and regulating it in different ways, maybe we'd include that. But no, gambling is the main one. Unfortunately, it is rather difficult to get the data. Different countries have such different forms of gambling. It's really quite different to alcohol and e-cigarettes, in which it's basically the same product being regulated in different ways. So, for example, in Britain, we have high street bookmakers where you can put money on horse racing. Lots of countries don't have that at all, don't have anything similar. So I think when you boil it down, every country has a lottery, but they're mostly state lotteries. Every country has casinos, but I'm not quite sure how you would evaluate different casino regulation. Every country, I guess, has kind of electronic fruit machines or pokies or similar. I don't know. I mean, the answer is I would like to include gambling because it's an obvious nanny state area, but I cannot get the hold of the data, and I'm not 100% sure I would be able to get it into a Nanny State Index style system if I did, but that would be the one I'd like to see.
Sure. Any other ideas what you would like to see in the Nanny State Index, the broader conception of nannying?
I just have to say that I would love to have the gambling in the index because we would win. We have the state monopoly.
But at least it's allowed. In some countries, I guess it's not even allowed.
Yeah, and the problem with gambling is because most of it happens also online, so it's kind of a cross-national, so it's hard to get the data, as Chris said. But yeah, cannabis, because it's illegal, then it would be a pretty flat index.
Sure. So no more controversial topics, Martin?
Maybe a controversial one, which is internet censorship, just because I think that it will be justified with the addiction theme. So maybe that would be for the future one thing to consider. So
controlling speech online, basically. Okay.
Not just that, but more or less regulation on social media, stuff like that, just to get rid of internet addiction. I think that would be one theme that would be pushed here. Sure.
Antonio, any new topics on your side?
I think there is a nice opportunity before us regarding the new labeling trends in Europe, which is going to be to turn normal food stuff into junk food overnight, and probably there is a way regarding that.
Okay, cool. So no incredibly controversial topics like prostitution or drug legalization. I guess we're not crazy libertarians completely. I have another question from an anonymous attendee on the future of paternalism in the UK. So Chris's thoughts are desired. What are Chris's thoughts on the current and future state of paternalism in the UK? Boris seems to have ditched his so-called libertarian self after his experience with COVID. So do you expect any kind of libertarian leaning reforms in the next couple of years, or should we completely give up on Boris?
I'm not very optimistic now. There is an outside chance that the government might repeal some elements of the EU tobacco products directive, particularly the bits affecting e-cigarettes, but I wouldn't hold my breath for that. Instead, the government has adopted a wide range of so-called anti-obesity policies that are designed to control the food supply. They've not been thought through at all. I think as a result of the practical problems they're going to have in implementing them, that the government will get its fingers burnt and will be a little bit more cautious perhaps in just taking any old idea from people in public health. But who knows? Could well be wrong. The government has a tobacco control strategy coming out fairly soon. I wouldn't expect to see anything too liberal in that, although it does kind of embrace tobacco harm reduction. So no, and there's no reason to be optimistic. Boris, had this reputation as being a libertarian. I can't think of anything he's ever done that's libertarian. So I'm not sure where that really came from. Mostly huff and puff when he was editing The Spectator. But by adopting all these anti-food policies, he's shown that he's really no different to any of his predecessors, but I don't think those policies are going to work at all well.
Not a lot of optimism on the UK front, unsurprisingly. From the UK, there is a question that's related to more global regulation. And the question is from Gregor Zwien, and he's asking or saying that the OECD will publish a new alcohol report on the 19th of May. This report defines any amount above 12 grams per day and 18 grams per day for female and male drinks as harmful. It estimates that harmful drinkers are responsible for an average GDP growth of 0 or 1.6% lower than it could be otherwise if alcohol were to be totally eliminated. Then GDP growth could be 2.1% higher. The report recommends availability and affordability restrictions as well as advertising restrictions. So why does such an analysis come from the OECD? Will anybody review the OECD's methodology? So I guess the question relates to more of the global regulations instead of the local ones. I'm not sure how much teeth the OECD has when it comes to regulating alcohol consumption, but I guess if it's putting out reports that GDP growth could be significantly higher if alcohol consumption were to be reduced, it might have an impact on how national governments think about that. Lasse, do you think that the hands of the Finnish government might be in this kind of topic as one of the countries that regulates alcohol consumption in the strongest possible way?
God, I hope not. This is a bit off topic, but in the Western countries and in the developed countries, the trend when consuming alcoholic beverages is towards lower alcohol volume drinks. So the demand is kind of developing. I have no idea why we would actually need regulation for that. People want actually gin drinks with a lot less alcohol in it. It might take years and years to change, but still it's not about just getting drunk or drinking a lot of alcohol. I don't know why the OECD wants why they want to be ahead and start or trying to start regulating it.
Chris and Martin and Antonio then. Chris?
That's could be. Well, yeah, I haven't heard anything about this report. I don't know why the OECD is sticking its nose in, but it's only a think tank at the end of the day. Big government-funded think tank, but a think tank nonetheless. It's entitled to its opinion. I mean, the Nanny State Index kind of shows that the policies that it's calling for don't really have the effect that is desired and expected. The evidence on alcohol advertising in particular is really very, very weak. The idea that you reduce alcohol consumption, let alone alcohol-related harm, which is of course a different thing, through restricting or banning advertising is very, very thin. So yeah, it's the same kind of stuff. You know, these guys they don't have that many policies, you know, and the policies they have aren't very imaginative. They just try and copy everything that's been done with smoking and think it's going to work with other stuff. And it takes me back to Boris and his food policies again. It's just, no, we restrict the advertising and people stop doing it. They don't. It doesn't really make any difference. It just takes money out of broadcasting and advertising platforms and restricts competition. That's a great lesson actually from the tobacco advertising ban. It massively restricts competition. You can't have any new entrants. Now, maybe people don't want new entrants in tobacco industry. I understand that, but we do in food, and I certainly do in alcohol.
Martin, do you share Chris's optimistic view that the OECD opinion doesn't really matter?
Of course I do. I just want to raise another point. Sorry, I didn't find my unmute button before, so that's why it didn't work. But I think this whole study shows how destructive both a focus on numbers instead of the utility of real individuals can have, and the focus on the macro instead of the micro level. So these are just, yeah, it might be that the GDP will shrink by 1.6%. I don't know that. I think Chris is right when he says it doesn't probably. But for me, it doesn't really matter, because what counts for me is the utility of free individuals. And if they want to drink more and repeatedly want to drink more, I think it might be the case. Maybe it's addiction, I'm not sure, but it might be the case that they have a higher utility if they repeat that action in relation to drinking less. Maybe that's the case. So I wouldn't take that as a good argument for regulating. That's my opinion.
Sure. Antonio, as a Spanish kind of researcher, do you think that having a glass of wine or maybe even two with a nice Spanish bit of steak gives you higher utility functions?
I think like the question is fantastic to highlight one thing. Politicians have been really successful in imposing their narrative, in imposing an intellectual premise behind all the paternalistic measures considered by the Nanny State Index, and it is they all look to focus on health, and it is clear they don't improve anybody's health, while they actually focus on habits, on substances that are hard to leave sometimes, and habits that are not related to health. So I think the index is fantastic to highlight that point and to work on that premise. They all constantly repeat. OECD, what WHO, all constantly on the same. If you read any of their reports, they talk about taxes instead of health constantly. So I think the premise is crucial. It is really important for us to focus on what they focus and not on their message.
Can I just add to what Martin said, that I don't know whether drinking reduces GDP by 1.6% or not, probably not, but let's go with it as a figure. It's not our job to raise GDP. If we work hard and earn more money, then collectively GDP will go up, and that's nice. But if we don't want to do that, we don't have to. If everyone just decides they want to have a long liquid lunch on a Friday, maybe GDP will go down. But so what? People's welfare is improved. Organizations like the OECD are always saying we need to get beyond GDP and focus more on well-being and happiness. So yeah, if people are happier drinking a bit more, it doesn't matter if GDP drops 1%.
So free marketeers are not just all about GDP growth. Yeah, I think that's a good proof for that as well. My last question, because we're slowly running out of time, and I would like to ask all of you to keep it very short. If you have to highlight one piece of crazy nanny state regulation from your own country, what would the craziest one be? I think Chris is thinking, so let's start with the winners of previous editions of the Nanny State Index. What's the craziest one in Finland, Lasse?
I think this regulation doesn't exist anymore, but if you were buying a glass of beer in a bar and kind of the outside terrace was, you had to step out of the door and cross kind of the pedestrian area to get into the terrace and sit down, you couldn't take your own beer with you. You have to have kind of someone from the bar to carry the beer to you, to the terrace.
Creating employment, I guess, but still pretty crazy.
Doesn't look good.
What was the craziest one in Spain, or what is the craziest one in Spain, Antonio?
There's a crazy one. As you know, there is no sin tax on wine, but there is sin tax on beer and spirits. And if we look at the curve across time, wine consumption has just plummeted, while beer and spirits consumption just rocketed. So it's stupid.
Doesn't make sense. Fair enough. Martin, over in Austria, reasonably liberal Austria, do you still have some crazy ones?
Well, honestly, I don't want to limit myself to one. I would get rid of all of them just because they are all crazy.
Chris, your final word as the editor. Sorry.
There are good regulations too, but I don't think the government should be in place to implement these regulations. I want private businesses and private people to implement regulations that are good for the area they are operating. That's my opinion.
So all nanny state regulations are the crazy category. Fair enough. Chris, final word to you as the editor of the index. You have seen every single piece that's included. What's the craziest one?
I think I'll give you two. One from Finland, which is, I think, also Iceland as well, where it is illegal to advertise licorice pipes. And they have little pipes made of licorice, and they have to be behind a screen, maybe in plain packaging, I don't know, but certainly you're not allowed to advertise them. And in Slovakia, you can't cycle after you've had more than 1 pint of beer, or the equivalent of. Maybe this might be a more widespread law than I'm aware of. I only became aware of it in Slovakia because prior to about 2 years ago, you couldn't drink at all before riding a bicycle. So this was a rare example of liberalization.
Just 1 pint. Fair enough. Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. I really enjoyed this discussion. It's good to see that there are some last Mohicans out there fighting for more liberal principles across the EU and Europe. And thanks to all of our audience as well, especially our donors, our hundreds of generous donors supporting our work. If you would wish to become one of them, you can now support our work on Patreon, where we have set up memberships where you can donate solely towards our digital output, subscribing to exclusive perks and benefits and priority access to content like this and much more. So do check out patreon.com/ilondon. And for our UK-based audience, we have an exciting event coming up with Dr. Liam Fox on the 24th of May at 6 o'clock, chaired by my colleague, Director General Mark Littlewood. And for the international audience, we are delighted to welcome you to the launch of the Initiative for African Free Trade and Prosperity, where intra-African trade will be at the forefront of the discussion. So that's going to take place on the 19th of May, and my colleagues just put the registration links into the chat. So all of you are very welcome. And last but not least, don't forget to check out nannystateindex.org before you start planning your summer holidays, because it could save you a lot on alcohol or cigarette duties, depending on where you're traveling. Gentlemen, thanks a lot for joining us, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you.